London, a city shrouded in fog and fear. The year is 1888. Gaslights cast flickering shadows, doing little to pierce the gloom. Cobblestone streets echoed with the hurried footsteps of its denizens. They were all scurrying home before the fall of night. Above the city, a dense smog clung to the rooftops like a shroud. The air was thick with coal smoke and the stench of damp earth. It was as if the very city itself was holding its breath, bracing for an unseen terror. For weeks, the city had been plagued by a string of gruesome murders. There was a serial killer afoot, each victim drained of their soul. Each body left grotesquely contorted and limbs were twisted. The newspapers called it the Scarlet Massacre. Fear clung to the city like the ever-present fog. Inside 221B Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes stood before the window smoking a pipe. His hawk-like gaze seemed to pierce the gloom. His long, slender fingers drummed a restless tattoo against the windowpane. He was not a man easily perturbed, but even Holmes seemed troubled by the case that lay before him. The Scarlet Massacre had baffled Scotland Yard. Even Inspector Lestrade, a man of considerable intellect, was at his wits' end. "Hannibal, my boy," Holmes said, turning from the window. "Do pay attention. This is no time for your usual daydreaming and shenanigans." Slumped in an armchair, Herdick Hannibal, Holmes's young apprentice, yawned. At 17 he possessed a keen intellect, but his arrogance and foolishness often overshadowed his talents. He found the whole affair rather dull and boring. "Do forgive me, Holmes," Herdick drawled, stifling another yawn. "But this Scarlet Massacre seems rather pedestrian, wouldn't you say? A bit too obvious." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Obvious? Pray tell, Hannibal, what is so obvious about a series of ritualistic murders that has baffled the entirety of Scotland Yard?" "It's the soul absorption, of course," Herdick said, with an air of boredom. "Far too much emphasis on the soul draining, a blatant attempt to mislead, if you ask me." Holmes sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Herdick's arrogance was as tiresome as it was predictable. "And what, pray tell, does our brilliant young detective propose we focus on instead?" Herdick grinned, his earlier boredom vanishing. "The footprints, my dear Holmes, the enormous impossible footprints. They were difficult to find." Holmes stared at his young apprentice for a moment. Then a slow smile spread across his face. "Hannibal, you insufferable, brilliant boy," he said, clapping a hand on Herdick's shoulder. "You may be onto something after all." He strode over to the table where a collection of evidence from the latest crime scene lay scattered. Among them, a plaster cast of a footprint. But this was no ordinary footprint. It was colossal, easily twice the size of a car. "The police have dismissed these as a hoax," Holmes said, examining the cast with a critical eye. "But I've always suspected there was more to it than meets the eye. I've witnessed something like this in another world." Herdick, suddenly energized, jumped to his feet. "Then what are we waiting for?" he exclaimed. "The game is afoot." The night was alive with the mournful cries of distant trains. Fog swirled around Holmes and Herdick as they made their way through the deserted streets. The gaslights cast eerie, elongated shadows. "Are you sure this is the right place, Holmes?" Herdick asked, his voice barely a whisper. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "The footprints led us here," Holmes replied, his voice low and steady, "and where the trail of the Scarlet Massacre leads, we follow." They stood before a towering Gothic cathedral. They then saw a bizarre boy running. They followed him. He vanished like thin air. They then saw a disturbing picture on the ground. It was of a gigantic, terrifying red-headed woman with glowing green eyes, and was surrounded by dead bodies in a creepy corner of an unknown part of the city. She had a blood-red Gothic dress. She towered over everything and had a sinister, unsettling grin. The part of the town they were in was blackened with soot and time and abandoned. The stained glass windows were dark, like the eyes of a blind man. A chill wind howled through the graveyard, rattling the iron gates. Herdick and Sholmes shivered, seeing the disturbing image. He put it in his pocket, pulling his coat tighter around him. He could have sworn he heard a faint, creepy music saying, "I'm a victim of her monstrous nature. She's an animal and I cannot tame her." The music was coming from within the cathedral itself. The music that seemed to vibrate in his very bones. Section 6. The Green Eye Song of Death. The interior of the cathedral was dark and cavernous. The air was thick with the smell of incense and decay. Dust motes danced in the faint light filtering through the grimy windows. As Holmes and Herdick ventured deeper into the cathedral, the music grew louder and more sinister. It seemed to be coming from the altar at the far end of the nave. "What is that music coming from?" Herdick whispered, his hand instinctively reaching for the revolver tucked into his coat pocket. Holmes held up a hand for silence, his eyes scanning the shadows. "Quiet, Hannibal," he hissed, "and whatever you do, don't take your eyes off the altar." Suddenly the air shimmered. The song reached a fever pitch, and then with a deafening crack the invisible became terrifyingly visible. Section 7. Give the people what they want, it's Scarlet Mama destroy time. Towering over them, a grotesque ghostly silhouette solidified against the dim light. It was the red-headed woman from the picture, but of monstrous size. Her skin was pale and beautiful, her cheeks round and complimentary. Her size dwarfed them like they are bugs. She had orange hair made into a ponytail. Her green eyes, looking dead and empty, were glowing, fixed upon them with a chilling intensity. Her smile was unsettling and psychopathic, that promised violence and pain before a dark death. She had freckles, red lips, and wore a tattered Victorian dress, stained crimson with what could only be painted completely with blood itself. Her hand, she had sharp fingernails dripping with red blood. She had a dead body on the other. She threw it as she started to get closer. This was no ordinary killer. This was the Scarlet Beast, an invisible serial killer giantess that haunted London in the shadows. She was the one behind the Scarlet Massacre murders. She then spoke. "You guys should feel embarrassed. You fell right into my trap," she boomed. Her voice was a honey-venomed, dark lullaby that echoed through the cathedral. "But don't be sad about it. There's still time. Time for Scarlet Mama to destroy and kill in a very violent and abhorrent way, and you're going to look very pretty when I do it." Before either Holmes or Herdick could react, Scarlet swung her hand, scratching them. The force of the blow sent them sprawling. Dust and debris rained down as the ancient altar shattered beneath her might as she kept disappearing and reappearing. Section 8. Herdick Hannibal's Gambit. "Run, Hannibal!" Holmes shouted, scrambling to his feet. He drew his revolver, firing off a shot at their monstrous attacker. But the bullet seemed to pass right through Scarlett as her body phased like a phantom. She merely laughed, a deep, unsettling sound that shook the very foundations of the cathedral. She then punched the foundations over and over. She then said, "It's finally time. Let's give the people what they want. It's Scarlet Mama destroy time!" She roared with an evil smile. Herdick, momentarily stunned, watched in horror as the clock tower above them began to crumble. Scarlett's attack had weakened the ancient structure, and now it was starting to give way. Massive chunks of stone crashed down around them. Thinking fast, Herdick grabbed a fallen piece of metal scaffolding. He hurled it at a nearby lever, one he'd noticed earlier. It controlled a massive chain, part of some forgotten renovation project. The chain whipped through its pulley, the other end attached to a massive, tarp-covered object. Section 9. The Mechanical Marvel. The tarp ripped away, revealing a mechanical marvel. A towering steampunk robot called the Mechanical Marvel, crafted from brass and steel and gold, stood before them. Steam hissed from its joints as it sprung to life, gears whirring and pistons pumping. Herdick had stumbled upon one of Holmes's secret projects, a mechanical marvel designed for just such an occasion. The automaton, powered by a complex system of gears and steam, lunged at Scarlett. Its metal fist connected with a resounding clang. It slapped her. She just laughed and started vanishing and reappearing around it, toying with the machine like it was a new toy for her to break. Taking advantage of the distraction, Holmes grabbed Herdick's arm and pulled him towards a side exit. But then Scarlett saw them try to leave, and then the door closed itself like something supernatural made it shut itself. Then both Herdick and Holmes were lifted into the air, choking, as the invisible Scarlett was about to kill them. Then the machine shot at her, making her angry, and she then went after it again. The doors opened. They ran for it. They didn't stop running until they were safely out of the cathedral and back on the fog-choked streets. Behind them, the sounds of battle raged, the clang of metal against bone, but Scarlett was winning against the machine. The roar of the automaton's steam engine got louder as it was being broken to bits. And above it all, the furious, psychotic roar of the Scarlet Beast. She then tore the machine to pieces. Her head then snapped backwards like the Exorcist, and she then crawled up the tower and vanished. As they disappeared into the fog, Herdick cast one last glance back at the cathedral. He could have sworn he saw a single, glowing green eye staring out from the shadows, and an evil smile, a shadow twitching like an evil entity trying to stay in existence. The clock tower finally gave way, collapsing in on itself. The Scarlet Massacre might be over for now, but Herdick knew, deep down, that Scarlet Thornhook would return. And when she did, London would be in a scarlet demise.